On the left is the Sony A80L, and on the right is the LG C3. Both of these are 2023 WRGB OLED TVs that share the same panel, and in most respects are very, very similar. So as you probably know at this point, the LG would have 4 HDMI 2.1 ports and uses WebOS. The Sony has 2 HDMI 2.1 ports and 2 HDMI 2.0B ports and uses Google OS. They both have peak HDR luminance of around 800 nits, and I'm going to demonstrate in this video how, for most part, they're pretty equal in luminance, and if anything, the Sony A80L actually might be a little bit brighter in certain areas, especially with color. As you can see on the waveform, how on the left side that matches the left TV, and then on the right side that's the C3, and then you can see where the lines are a little bit higher on the A80L in the majority of these, even though if you take actual window measurements, the A80L is going to measure lower, but in real content it's slightly brighter, except in a few instances, and in color, luminance is at least decently noticeably brighter. It does seem that LG is willing to push the white subpixel harder, whereas Sony is willing to push the color pixels a little bit harder. So in an image like this, we can see the LG C3 looks brighter, but it is also whiter. If you look at the bottom portion of the image, you get a little bit more color brightness out of the Sony. Then when it comes to SDR, it's kind of similar. So on LG, if you enable peak brightness, it will increase the brightness, but you also see the color saturation drop pretty significantly. Whereas on Sony, the peak luminance setting behaves differently. Now on the LG, if you increase the OLED pixel brightness all the way, and then on Sony, if you were to do that and then have peak brightness and peak luminance off, the LG is going to be a lot brighter because of the way they tune these, so they're not one for one. Now if we max out the SDR brightness on the Sony on the left, you can see that with the C3, as I go through the different peak brightness options, you can see 1, the change in color, and 2, it doesn't really quite get as bright as the Sony. However, with the Sony on peak luminance high, it can dim down more aggressively, whereas on medium, that's a safer option on the Sony. So with the Sony at max brightness and medium peak luminance, and then the LG with peak brightness off and the slider set to 80 to 100, they're pretty well matched, right on the nearly 300 nit range for SDR, maybe 320, but that's kind of about as far as they go with SDR. Before on the Sony, it would cause more aggressive dimming, or on the LG, you lose more color saturation. So now if we focus on HDR, another thing that is quite different between them is the way they do tone mapping. So with Sony, you pretty much need to have the gradation preferred option turned on to have an accurate image that tracks EOTF well. However, when doing so, it will roll off highlights at the top end. So in a scene like this, where there's a little circle for the sun, you can't see it in HDR10 with gradation preferred on the Sony. However, if you go to Dolby Vision, which retains more detail, you will see it. However, with Dolby Bright, it's going to be over brightened, and Dolby Dark is going to be under tracking EOTF a bit too much. So if you use Dolby Bright and then turn on gradation preferred, that's kind of the best solution on the A80L, but it's still not perfect or as good as the LG when it comes to accuracy. So on the LG, regardless if you're in Dolby or HDR10, you can make out the sun in that highlight just because of the way the tone mapping is, and it doesn't have that more aggressive roll-off that the Sony has with HDR10. Now I'm going to be quiet and let you hear the speakers. They are level matched for volume, so the numbers are different. Just pay attention for when one is muted and one is not.
anything else, I have diminishing returns.
Sir Laszlo, he protected me in Sintra, and he said less than perfect means death.
Your stomach's growling loud enough to wake the dead, if that counts.
Hunger makes for good sauce.
Also makes for shitty lunches. Siri. You are safe here. Was it the Black Knight again? If he's still haunting you.
Whose turn is it for lunch?
I'd say they both perform pretty well for audio, pretty equally, just in different ranges. Now moving on to processing, I'm going to spend a lot of time in this review focusing on the processing elements. So starting here with streaming content, the Sony was set up in a way that's pretty typical with noise reductions on auto and smooth gradation on low, and you can kind of see the difference where on the LG, kind of going through the settings trying to find what gets us closest to that as far as clearing up some noise in the image without moving or removing too much detail. So what you would find on the LG is that the settings for clarity do not have as much of a visual impact as they do on Sony. They're much less aggressive. So setting them to around the medium range is kind of similar to auto or low on the Sony. However, when you use any of these clarity features, you're going to have other issues that can pop up. So now in a darker scene that's very low bit rate with lots of macro blocking, you can see how each of these settings causes flickering and detail loss or other artifacts or side effects. So, this is really going to be a personal preference for you to decide based on the content that you watch a lot of, which you prefer. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to set cinema mode on the LG to have the clarity menu settings basically on medium-ish to kind of match the Sony, and then be playing around with the Sony and leave like smooth gradation on low or off. Smooth gradation is generally one of the more beneficial clarity options on the Sony. However, it does also affect scenes like this as far as like the flickering. So if I increase the exposure on the camera, you can really get an idea what's going on here in the sky, where we have more actual like block images on the LG that are more smoothed out on the Sony. However, you also see more of those artifacts in that dark scene. Now again, here another dark scene, low bit rate, lots of macro blocking behind the fog here in this scene. We can already see where on the Sony the fog itself is more smoothed over, whereas on the LG you can see like the lines and the details in the fog more. And this is also with the LG currently in the cinema mode with some of that processing turned on, whereas in the filmmaker mode all the other settings are matched, and then all of that is, the processing is disabled. So you can really see here as I'm going through the different settings on the Sony, like smooth gradation, how much it removes detail as you turn it up higher. So really don't want to go above low on that if you're going to use it at all. And then on the LG, around medium seems to be closest to low on the Sony. However, you can really see a lot more detail if you just turn it off on the LG. Then on the Sony, if you turn it to off, it's not really off though, it's more like low on the LG. The only way to really disable it on the Sony is to use the graphics or game mode, but then that will lock you out of all the clarity settings and the motion settings. So a lot of people will not do that. And do keep in mind that the A80L is using the latest processor from Sony, the XR Cognitive, with the XR Clear Image. So what Clear Image does is it can detect the native source material. So say you have an Apple TV outputting 4K, but the original stream is dropping down to say 720p or 1080p or something like that. The TV can actually detect that's happening and that the Apple TV is doing some upscaling, and then Sony can go in and decide where to touch and what things to do or not do. When it comes to motion, Sony does 96 Hz instead of 120 that LG does, and I'm going to have another video going much deeper into the motion differences, so keep an eye out for that. Moving on now to gaming. So in game mode on the Sony, you actually get working smooth gradation. So you can see here how there's far less color banding or pasteurization on the Sony, especially with the smooth gradation on low. Another thing that's good with the Sony is if you play a game that does not support HGIG, like God of War here, because it's based around having gradation preferred on all the time, that you can basically just play any game and you're going to get your highlight detail. Whereas on LG, if you have HGIG on, it's going to clip the highlights and you lose detail and color in the brighter objects. So you'd have to turn on dynamic tone mapping or set it to off in order to retain that color and detail in the brighter parts of the image for games that don't support HGIG or don't have luminance sliders. However, for games that do support HGIG or let you limit the brightness, then you will have more defined highlights with HGIG on the LG. Now, one thing though with LG is in the game mode, they don't really push the color luminance as much as they do outside of game mode. So you can really see that here where some of the colors on the Sony have more punch and impact and are able to get higher luminance out of color. So now moving on to another issue that the LG has in lower luminance scenes, especially with candlelight where the luminance is changing, you can really see some banding, pasteurization issues. So especially like candlelit or firelit scenes like this in dark rooms. Now another thing too is the LG is more crushed without a calibration, meaning some of the shadow detail is lost, whereas the Sony shows more of the dark shadow detail. But if you really look between the darker and brighter areas on the LG, as that light flickers and moves, you can see those lines and bands in the color near black. And that's one of the issues that the G3 shares as well. And this is a game that has a in-game nit slider where you can set the nit value, so it's set to 800 nits. And now I'm going to go through the different tone mapping options and show you how it really affects the color and look of the fire, because this is an area where WRGB OLED really struggles, is with especially bright fire color like this. It can either be turning more white or green, or with like dynamic tone mapping on, it can make it more red and not as bright. And then the other concern is as you change the tone mapping options on both TVs, you're also affecting the EOTF tracking. So on LG, you generally want to have it on HGIG unless you have it calibrated with a custom tone map upload, which would apply to the off setting. And then on the Sony, again, you want to really have it on gradation preferred. Now if we move into SDR gaming and max out the SDR brightness, because the peak brightness is locked out on the LG in SDR game mode, you can see that the Sony is pretty considerably brighter in SDR gaming. I have sped this footage up a lot so that way I can show with the static elements on screen though, how over a certain amount of time, the Sony will gradually dim down until they're pretty close in luminance. The Sony is still just a hair brighter, but it's not as significant of a difference as it was at the start. So the LG will retain a consistent brightness, whereas the Sony can be brighter in SDR games. It's just it will dim if it's maxed out. If you put the peak luminance on medium, the dimming is far less aggressive and less noticeable, and basically is about the same level as where the LG would be with the OLED light set to 100, and again peak brightness is off because it's locked out. So that's pretty much going to wrap up this comparison review of the two. I wanted to have this released earlier in the year when I shot this, but time constraints could not get to it in time. So now I know it's 2024, there's new TVs on the horizon, but this should still be relevant, especially if you're looking to pick up a deal. So be sure to look out for the motion test between the two, and I will catch you all in that video. Thanks for watching.